Yo guys, what is going on? JPS back with another video, and today we're going to be reacting to why driving in Europe is better than America, and this is from an American expat's perspective. I've always thought about this, driving on the right side of the road versus the left side of the road, more roundabouts, much more condensed highways and general roads, and which one's better? You know what I mean? There's just so many differences between driving in America and driving throughout Europe. So I thought this would be a good video to watch on this channel because we've covered a decent amount, not nearly enough, but we've covered Germany. I don't think Australia doesn't count as Europe, but they do drive on the left side of the road. So there are some European tendencies throughout Australia, at least in driving. But anyways, we'll get right into this. Hit the like button, subscribe, and let's go.
I love driving, and I especially love driving in Europe. I've been living in Europe for about 2 years now, originally from Orlando, Florida. I've lived in Amsterdam for about 2 years now. Amsterdam isn't exactly a car place, but I've always been a car person, and I've always loved driving. What I like about living in Europe is that European drivers are excellent, especially compared to American drivers. I was inspired for this video after watching a video by Tedward, which I'll link in the description below. In his video, he was explaining why Americans don't use a 3-lane highway correctly, and it got me thinking how much I appreciate driving in Europe. European drivers are some of the best I've seen, and I think some of the best in the world, and I'm hoping to explain why I believe so in this video. Now, I haven't done any research. This is just my experience, so if I'm wrong about anything, please correct me in the comments. This is just my perspective, having lived in Europe for 2 years, having driven mostly around Western European countries such as Netherlands, Switzerland, France, Germany, UK, and in the US, I primarily have driven in Florida. So Florida's not exactly known for the best drivers, especially we get a lot of tourists who don't know how to drive in the US, and a lot of elderly folks.
Yeah.
And just people who don't know the right rules of the road. So that's my benchmark. That's what I'm comparing against.
This introduction has given this video a lot of merit to me because he's explaining that perfectly. That's exactly how I feel. And after being driven around in Britain, I thought the drivers there were incredible. Super narrow roads. They were navigating the tightest of crevices. And I was just like, how have you not crashed yet? Because if this were an American driver, we'd be off the side of this cliff right here in the Lake District.
One of the main reasons I think European drivers are better is just driving in general is a privilege. So if you look at most European places, most European cities, you don't need a car. You don't need to drive anywhere.
Exactly.
Public transportation is well established. You can use a train, a metro, a tram to get pretty much anywhere you need to go. You can use public transportation to get pretty much anywhere. So you don't really need to drive. Only if you live in more suburban parts of Europe, but even then public transportation is still available. So Europeans don't have to drive. They want to drive. And because they want to drive, they put more effort into it. On top of that, getting a driver's license in most European countries is a much more involved and expensive process. For example, in the Netherlands, getting a driver's license can cost a couple €1,000 because you have to do mandatory driving lessons. On top of that, the age to get a driver's license is much older than most states in the US. So I believe in the Netherlands you can start learning to drive around 16 and a half years old. That's when you do your theory test.
Look at all the
and
bikers
start
up there
doing driving lessons. You don't have a full driver's license without restrictions until you're 18 years old. Compared to Florida, where I'm from, you start driving at 15. You do your theory test and you start driving at 15, and you only have to have a learner's permit for 1 year. And there's no mandatory driving lessons. Your parents can teach you how to drive. On top of that, the cost in general for driving is much lower. Cost of getting a driver's license is much lower in the US. And driving is kind of a necessity in a lot of parts of the United States, except for major metropolitan cities. You have to drive. So getting a driver's license is less of a privilege in the US and more of a necessity. So that distinction alone, I think, contributes to a lot of the differences that I'm going to point out. So getting a driver's license is a much more involved process, especially in countries like the Netherlands. In Germany, it also requires mandatory lessons. It costs a lot of money. So when they invest that much into getting a driver's license, they don't want to lose it. They learn to drive properly. They learn the right rules of the road. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize that, and they drive accordingly.
Yeah.
You can see here in this example, I'm just outside of Amsterdam. There's nobody cruising in the left lane. I'm driving at 5:30 in the afternoon right now. Nobody is cruising in the left lane.
That's so
The left lane is
crazy.
only for passing. You can see
Imagine.
how people use the lanes. They're very well disciplined. And that's a common theme. They're well-disciplined drivers. This goes back to how they learn to drive. They have to take mandatory lessons. Their parents aren't teaching.
This clip of him driving right here is blowing my mind. This white car got over. This car got over after he passed him. Bro, it's just like, why? Why can't we have... Oh my God, it hurts.
Their parents aren't passing on bad habits about driving. They're learning the proper rules of the road. They're executing them while they learn to drive. So even though you take a theory test in the US on what the rules of the road are, you don't really remember that. You remember what you learned while you were learning to drive.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's from what your parents taught you. And that's not the case in Europe.
It's always your parents teaching you.
You'll see here the highway just widened up and people immediately start moving to the right. Not everybody, but most people do. Nobody's fighting, nobody's rushing. They're just following the rules. They're well disciplined. Don't get me wrong, not everybody follows every rule. You can see there are some more aggressive drivers sometimes, but it's not the norm. And even the more aggressive ones tend to get on their way, get out of the way. They're not messing with anybody. They're not pissing anybody off. There's no real road rage. So discipline is one of those key important attributes. The next thing is
they got over. I was like, why are you in the left lane?
The roads are well maintained. I'm going off of what I've seen in the Netherlands and Germany. Not every European country has the same privilege. I've seen some pretty poor roads in countries like Belgium. And even I've heard in Italy, roads aren't as nice. But you can see here the highway is well maintained. There are no potholes. It's quite wide. And people use the lanes correctly. So even though there's a lot of lanes, it allows for a lot of capacity because people actually follow the rules of the road. They stay to the right, they only pass on the left, they pass and then they get back over. And that's the general way it works here. So when they add more lanes, when the highway is wider, it allows for much more free-flowing traffic, a lot more capacity, a lot more cars. Unlike places like Houston where they added lanes, nobody follows proper rules there, so they continue to sit in the left lane, even if it's 16 lanes wide, and it doesn't help the traffic situation at all. In this area, this is a speed-controlled area, so it's actually controlled by average speed cameras. I'll deep dive into that in a separate video, but the Netherlands has some of the strictest speed laws in Europe.
Really?
Talking about the rules of the road, when you look at truckers, they also follow the rules very strictly in Europe. They're almost always all the way to the right. They rarely are passing. There are zones where they're not allowed to pass. They're rarely in the left lane. They're rarely passing.
Bro, truck drivers in the United States are so aggressive. Like, they'll pass. They'll be swerving all over the road. I'm not, like, it's insane.
When they do pass, they get back over to the right lane immediately. There's less clogging of traffic. So discipline, learning the rules of the road, following them, these are important themes. The process to get a driver's license is much more involved, much more strict. Another thing with driving in Europe, in my opinion, the cars are much more solid. They're much more roadworthy. You have vehicle inspections, so people can't drive old, beat-up cars. You have to have your vehicle inspected ever so often. Depending on the age of the vehicle, it's either once a year or once every few years. There's rules about what the vehicle can or can't have equipped on it. It has to pass inspection for you to keep driving it on the road. So the roadworthiness of vehicles is also better. And some states have this. Florida in particular doesn't have this. So you see people driving on the highway with rickety vehicles that are falling apart. They've gotten into an accident and they haven't fixed the vehicle. It's a road hazard, in my opinion. That doesn't happen here. People maintain their cars well in the first place. They have to maintain them well because to keep driving them on the road, they have to pass the inspections. Germany has some of the strictest inspection laws. You can see many videos on YouTube about passing the TÜV inspection. I haven't had to go through this personally in the Netherlands, but I do know that inspections are required. I haven't seen any poorly maintained vehicles on the road. And because of this, because of the discipline, because of the roadworthiness of the vehicles, generally Europe has higher speed limits. The Netherlands used to have a national speed limit on the highway of 130 kilometers an hour, which equates to 81 miles per hour. People used to drive faster than that. Recently, as of March of 2020, there's a national speed limit of 100 kilometers an hour until 7 p.m. Some roads are still 100 kilometers per hour in general. I'll do a separate deep dive into that in another video about the Netherlands. But in general, countries like Germany or France, the highest speed limit you'll see on suburban highways is 130 kilometers an hour. And people drive faster than that. You can easily drive 140 kilometers an hour without any issue. And again, if everybody follows these rules of the road, driving that fast, even on narrow highways, isn't an issue. You can also see in the Autobahn, people driving much faster than that. It's a 2-lane highway, yet there's very little accidents. And that goes back to the discipline of following the rules of the road. People keep to the right. Even if somebody is driving faster than you, it's completely safe. I'll have to do another video about the Autobahn because that's a whole experience in and of itself. As an American, I truly love and appreciate the Autobahn, and I wish that America had that privilege, but honestly, the drivers don't deserve it.
Hell no, they don't deserve it.
Another reason driving in Europe is so much better, again, going back to the discipline, you'll see this as a common theme. There's very little distracted driving. People are focused on driving while they're driving. They're not on their phones, they're not eating, they're not really drinking coffee, they're not reading a book, they're not doing all of these crazy things you see people in America.
Yo, you guys should, like, all right, picture this. This is last week, I'm not kidding. I'm driving on a highway, and the car next to me, you can see right through their windshield, or their window. I'm like directly next to them. There's a little kid in the front seat, in the passenger seat, and a mom in the front seat. The mom has her food up on the dashboard. She's eating noodles, some type of Asian noodles with like chicken in them. I could see that too. She's eating them, and then she's propped up and she's like pressing her chest against the wheel to keep it straight while her kid's on like watching some video on the phone. Like, if that isn't the epitome of American driving, I don't know what it is. And it's all that people are always, looking down on their phones, like, oh, it's crazy. It's really crazy.
Could do while they drive. They're focused on driving, and they have to be focused on driving. You're not allowed to be using your phone. You're not allowed to be eating while you're driving. You're not allowed to be doing anything but driving while you're driving. In fact, in the Netherlands, they started rolling out a system where there are cameras over the highways that will look at cars and take pictures. If you're caught driving while you're on your phone or doing something while you're distracted while you're driving, they'll actually mail you a ticket. So they're very strict about enforcing no distracted driving, and people follow it. People focus on driving. And when you focus on driving and you have drivers that are focused on driving, you can have much more freedom and much more driving enjoyment. So distracted driving
and that's the ironic part, is a lot of these policies and restrictive guidelines on driving and laws in the United States would face enormous amounts of backlash for being too restrictive and being, too much infringement on our freedom. When in reality, if everyone does end up following these rules, like he just said, you end up with a very civil road where there's more freedom and you're allowed to maneuver and go as fast as you like, take the risks that you want to take. Instead, we end up with the absolute, I'm not even going to say the word, mess of American highways and American roads. And it all bakes down to those guiding principles that so many people just can't throw away. The idea of, the freedom and it's like, y'all making me want to move to Europe, honestly. This is crazy.
Isn't really a thing here, and it's really well enforced. I think that helps contribute to some of the driving characteristics of some of the roads. People are much more focused. So there aren't really distractions while you're driving. You're focused on driving, you're paying attention, and this is part of the reason why there are some things you really need to pay attention to while you're driving in Europe. Things like roundabouts, things like speed humps, things like pedestrian zones, bicycle lanes, trams, buses. horses that are allowed to be in traffic, a lot of different things that you need to pay attention to, and that's why you really need to pay attention while you're driving, and Europeans do in general. Now, as an American driving in Europe, I am guilty of carrying over some of my bad habits about distracted driving. But when I need to pay attention, I pay attention. And I've always thought of that in the US as well. I pay attention while I'm driving, I focus on driving, I get pleasure out of that, and that's the norm here in Europe. You drive when you're driving, you're not doing anything else. It's not a time when you're, catching up on emails or reading a book or eating your lunch. You can see here, this is one of these roads that's almost one car width wide. It shares a bicycle lane, and this is a bi-directional road. You really have to pay attention here. You have to mind the space. If a car's coming in the other direction, you have to squeeze to the right and make sure there's enough space. But when the road is empty like this, you can enjoy it. One difference with Europe, generally people don't use cars to commute. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people that do commute to work by car in Europe and European cities, but in general, cost of parking is very expensive. Fuel is very expensive. People don't use a car to commute if they don't have to. So people will often defer to public transportation to get to work. So people aren't driving regularly as much as they do in the US. So usually when they're driving, it's for pleasure, not so much necessity. Of course, it's maybe necessity to go somewhere, but they're focused on driving while they're doing it. It's not part of their morning commute. And this is generally speaking, this is my take. It's not scientific, of course. I like that I can choose to drive when I want to drive. I can enjoy driving. I'm lucky that I live in Amsterdam. I don't have to commute. I don't have to commute by car. Another thing I've noticed is when people are towing something or carrying cargo, it's well secured, it's covered with a net. Things don't fly out of trucks. Things don't fly out of trailers.
Happens all the time
when
here.
They're towing something or when they're carrying something or hauling something, they're staying to the right. They're driving in the slower lane. They're not passing anybody. They're not driving erratically. I remember regularly seeing in Florida landscaping trucks with trailers with things that are just bouncing around, flying around, things that could fly off of the trailer in any second. And those guys are driving 80-something miles an hour in the passing lane, passing cars, driving erratically. That just doesn't happen here. When you consider some of the points that I've mentioned, driving in Europe is overall safer. If people follow the rules, it makes for a safer experience for cars, for pedestrians, for cyclists. It also makes for a better driving experience as a driver. And that's why I love driving in Europe. After a long road trip, I don't feel exhausted. I don't feel like I was dealing with a lot of bad drivers. I don't feel like I was dealing with a lot of people sitting in the left lane. I don't feel that fatigue that you feel when you drive in America.
Because it's frustrating.
I actually feel quite relaxed while I drive. And it's because there's similar people like me driving, people who want to drive, people who enjoy driving, people who pay attention while they're driving. So I feel like I'm sharing the road with a lot of like-minded individuals. I also feel like driving in Europe, I've become a better driver. I've learned things that I didn't learn in America. Roundabouts, for example, dealing with cyclists regularly. Like I said, this is my personal experience. It's definitely...
I think another point to be touched on. So first of all, my general consensus, not just after this video, I was kind of already at this conclusion, is that driving in Europe is indeed significantly better than driving in America. I completely agree with that. Just based off of what I've seen throughout many videos, throughout actually being in Europe, in England specifically, and being driven around in multiple vehicles in different places. I can safely say that driving in Europe is probably better than America. Again, I have to experience that for myself. But another thing that wasn't necessarily touched on in this video was the practicality of vehicles. Obviously, having a large vehicle or vehicles in general isn't exactly subsidized throughout Europe, but I feel as if Europeans are a lot more practical with their vehicles and the space that they need. You see a lot more compact and subcompact cars, obviously for the fuel efficiency, but also because you just don't need a 2-ton pickup truck to go to work every day. And that's something Americans just can't get through their head, because in many ways your vehicle is an extension of your identity and who you are. I mean, if you see people having these huge outbreaks when other people touch their car or mess around with their stuff, it really is an extension of your person. Like, people treat their cars like it's like, oh my god, it's just a car, and you don't need to have the best looking one or the biggest one. That's how it goes over here, and I just find it really ridiculous. Personally, you guys know I drive a Toyota Corolla. Great reliability, great fuel efficiency, and I just don't need anything more than that. You know what I mean? It's a great purchase. So yeah, this video does make me want to move out of the United States and into Europe, specifically for driving, but there's a lot of other reasons as well. So we'll see, guys. We'll see. But it was a great video. Really enjoyed this guy's perspective, especially because I could relate to a lot of what he was saying since he lived in America, Orlando specifically, which is Florida's quite the place, guys. Florida's quite the place if you haven't been there. But anyways, let me know what you guys thought of the video and what your experience has been like driving throughout Europe. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'm going to catch you all in the next one. Peace.